Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Mad in America podcast. This is Ayurveda, your host for today. As I conduct this interview, we are living in strange and scary times because of the massive outbreak of COVID-19 across the world. I'm hoping that next time I speak with all of you, things will be better. Meanwhile, in the world of psychiatry and psychology, things are always on the move. A new study in Lancet Psychiatry found that migrants living in high-density areas with other migrants from the same place of origin are less likely to suffer from psychosis. A new special issue in transcultural psychiatry has brought together researchers from different disciplines who have demanded a move away from the biomedical model and its colonial roots when it comes to the global mental health movement. And lastly, a new article in World Social Psychiatry has yet again asserted that psychology and psychiatry often ignore the context and knowledge of the global South, causing more problems than solving them. These last two articles provide a perfect segue to introduce our guest today, Dr. Sunil Bhatia. Dr. Bhatia is a professor of human development and the chair of his department at Connecticut College. He is the author of 2 books and around 50 articles in book chapters, and his second book received the 2018 William James Book Award from the APA. His area of expertise is cultural psychology, decolonizing psychology, migrant and racial identities, and qualitative methods. And he has many, many awards to his name. I'm not going to name all of them. But to me personally, the most important thing is that you, much like me, were born in India and then came to the US later on. And so let's get into this. Dr. Bhatia, welcome to Mad in America.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored. This is a real privilege on one level to speak to you, but also, I share my concerns about speaking in the time that we are in this global crisis. Mm-hmm. And so I want to acknowledge, the profound inequality that this crisis has revealed. And you and me right now, at least at this moment, aren't experiencing that. So
absolutely, yes, that's true.
So it's a privilege and an honor, but yet I share my, anxiety and solidarity with the rest of humanity that's going through it.
Thank you for saying that. So with that, let's get into the questions because they're all about pretty much the equality and the way it affects all of us and the way it affects us psychologically. So a lot of your work has been on what we call decolonization of psychology. Could you tell our listeners what exactly that is, decolonization of psychology?
Yes, I could. Decolonizing psychology draws essentially on 3 different frameworks. One directly draws on indigenous psychology or what I would call native studies, which is embedded in settler colonialism. The second one, it draws directly on decolonial theory that comes out of Latin American intellectuals or the geographic space, I would say, of Latin America. And then the third comes out of post-colonial theory, which I'm most familiar with, and it speaks to me personally as well. So when I was thinking about decolonizing psychology, I was drawing and reading these frameworks to ask a question basically about who is telling the story of psychology, who has the power to construct knowledge about psychology, and who has the power to disseminate that knowledge, and whose voices are being included in that story of psychology. So that, I would say, is sort of more questions I had about decolonizing psychology when I approached it.
All right. So could you tell me what started your interest in this? Like what happened? When did it happen that you said, okay, this is something I want to look into?
I went to 7 years of university and college in Pune, and my curriculum was in psychology and philosophy. Largely, I was reading theorists, key concepts that were in British and American textbooks. My syllabus was largely frozen from colonial times. And all the psychology that I was reading were essentially British and American. And it occurred to me very early on that there was a disconnect between reading and giving exams on the psychologists and what I was experiencing in my cultural space and cultural life of growing up in India. So I could see in rituals in public spaces and bus stops, and I would drive my moped, my Luna. I would see cultural spaces, cultural meanings, cultural frameworks everywhere. The modern, the feudal, the post-colonial, the neoliberal, all different multi-layers of cultural meanings and practices around me in my public, private spaces. But when I brought questions about culture to the classroom, we were actually talking about psychology, I was completely forbidden to ask those questions.
Wow,
So
even in India.
Yeah, in India. That's how it started. Because around those times, they said that wasn't scientific enough to ask questions about specifically ways in which religious meaning was so critical to understanding Indian psychology. So I was asking questions a lot about meaning-making frameworks that I wanted to employ in my life, but I found there was no answers I was getting from my texts or professors or the curriculum, which was very Eurocentric in its instruction and the exams and the way it was even being delivered. So that was the first, I would say, disconnect, which led me to ask questions about doing a psychology that was much more rooted in culture, but in a way that culture wasn't just another object or a variable, but culture was deeply embedded in stories of psychology. And so I did not have answers, and I, like many other students, I did what I had to do, got my degree. I felt very alienated from the very context of knowledge production that was happening in Indian universities. And then I decided to come to Clark University to in the developmental psychology program, where culture, narrative, identity was far more prominent. I would say around the time I was doing my doctoral work, there was a kind of linguistic, interpretive, cultural narrative turn occurring within the humanities, including, I would argue, feminist turn, where questions about whose knowledge, gendered knowledge, knowledge in social location. So those were also being imported within psychology, at least in my department. As I went deeper into it, formulating a story of people from the global south as having somewhat of a deficient humanity, as well as the stories about people of color, whenever they came up in that psychology, were also relegated to the margins. And finally, over the last 10 years, when I was trying to address the gaps, I saw, there were 356 million Indian youth who are such a gigantic, big part of our humanity, but nowhere I could see them in the canon as well. Their voice, their realities, their sociocultural realities, they were thinking, was completely erased or not worth seeing. Their stories, I ask, why aren't they worth telling those stories? What is it that's missing?
Right.
So that was the third, I would say, shift that occurred in my thinking that then gave me the motivation to come up with a decolonizing framework to speak to these absences, but also to speak to the realities of the people who are the majority for humanity, but largely missing from the field.
Absolutely, and there is a lot of research that actually corroborates that. Who research is done on and where it is applied. So you talked about doing your undergrad and postgrad in India in this really Eurocentric framework, and psychology is being taught to you, but you move out of your classroom and you see a very different world. And there is a disconnect, an alienation between what you're studying, and then you're not being allowed to ask questions because it's not scientific. Can you think of like an example of such a thing, or like a story? Like
one concept that comes to mind is the very concept of oppression and internalized oppression, or I would say internalized colonialism that I was feeling in my master's at University of Pune. In the 7 years of psychology that I was studying, I was also looking at how psychologists had, the founders of psychology had portrayed Indians in their work. And they represent stark, highly racist. The key founders of psychology, such as Darwin and others, had, and even J.C. Stanley Hall had spoken about people living in colonized places and as subjects as primitive savages. And as I was reading that, I also found out that there were these very people who were representative of the British culture, such as Churchill had called Indians a beastly people. And yet in my 7 years of studying that subject, I was always told that the British culture, the American culture, was much more superior. They were far more advanced. They were far more better than us. So when I told my professors and I challenged them that why do we continue to study this knowledge that's so highly colonialized and has treated historically Indians as slaves in this highly racist language, not see our own internal colonialism here. At that point in time, the very oppression that I was speaking about, that I was feeling, was basically dismissed off as my rebellion or my challenge or an individual framework.
Right.
And even other kinds of histories that are brought in, for example, Ambedkar's history, caste hierarchies.
Yes.
Within my university, I was, as part of our own collective solidarity, I used to talk to other graduate students from sociology in my own university who were teaching me really about caste hierarchies. And upon reading Ambedkar's book, The Annihilation of Caste, I was able to bring some of the oppressive structures that have been built into for centuries with context. I said, why aren't we studying the psychology of caste at that point in time? But that was not in the canon again
at all.
And that's and so that was one example. To me, it was very powerful, that psychology of identity of middle class people based on studies done in the United States. I'm not saying class wasn't important, but the way class functions in India is very much deeply tied to caste. So as I was writing for my master's, I was told not to bring caste in my analysis of class, because that would confuse, complicate, make it messy. And whereas we need to keep our explanations much more easy and simple and scientific and so on.
And I don't know, I think very few people in the West really know about like the subtle ways this kind of internalized colonization works, how speaking in English is supposed to be, or wearing Western clothes is supposed to be a marker of class and high caste and sophistication and intellect. And all of those things get mixed up. I used to joke when I was an undergrad saying that I was doing a degree in psychology, and I would say that I could probably get a job in computer engineering if I just spoke well enough. And it was a joke, but it showed something about us. And absolutely. So you talked about being kind of these dialogues that you were trying to have in class and those being pushed away. And that kind of brings us to the way Indian academics and psychologists have internalized these representations, right? Can you say something about that?
You asked me the question about what are the ways in which Indian academics and Indian psychology
internalize these representations.
Internalized in internal colonialism as such.
Yes.
I mean, one way, as I said, was from an academic point of view, the way they conducted themselves in academia was the politics of what I would call representation. That is, they didn't challenge the representation very much.
Right.
So what was in the books, what was in the canon, what was being exported as is,
Right.
to so-called departments in the third world. There was a movement to indigenize it, that is, to give it an Indian flavor or reframe it. But largely the core thinking, the core positivistic ideas, the core empirical structure, theory, canon, ideas, knowledge was never disturbed as such. They gave it a different name, which Indianized it slightly, but it did not really change the core definitions of what psychology is. The second, I would say, is politics of location. That is, even though they were located, many of them, in very deep socioeconomic conditions of their own background, some were from middle class psychologists, some were from upper class, and some were from Dalit backgrounds in our university. Even in their own biographies or their own social location, they weren't allowed to speak to that. So their experiences, their existential experience of living in India, in these caste hierarchies, the sociocultural identity they had, they thought it was really important to keep it at their home. That was the second place that I found. They sometimes acknowledged it, that it's really important to speak to their own social location, but yet you do not bring that into the knowledge production process.
Yeah.
And the third place, I would call it the politics of practice. So in the applied frameworks, when they were doing their therapy, I found that as a culture, we spent thousands of years thinking about the self, thinking about the meaning of self, thinking about nirvana, liberation, meaning making, both at the metaphysical level, philosophical, psychological level. We had all this vocabulary, but all that vocabulary was pushed to philosophy because it was not seen that it could be given scientific credibility. So at the level of practice tools such as yoga and stress related or stress reduction exercises, they were largely borrowed from the West too. There wasn't much room to bring in, at least that point in time, what I would call indigenous healing frameworks or indigenous frameworks for understanding our mental life, because it was relegated to religion or philosophy.
Right.
So these were sort of three areas that I would kind of map out as being, highly colonized, as representations of being colonized, but also where you would see this kind of disconnect that we were speaking about earlier.
I want to come back to that thing that you talked about in terms of the self. But before I ask you about that, let me ask you this. So you're trying to do all of this work on decolonizing psychology, and you've been trying for years. Have you received any kind of pushback? Or like, what have been the major challenges and where did they come from?
There was pushback throughout my career, because especially when you are beginning or developing any idea that's opposed to mainstream ideas, the pushback can be very severe because your job, your career, your publications are dependent on it.
Right.
So when I wrote my 2002 paper on historical representations and post-colonial psychology,
the Orientalism one.
Orientalism, and rethinking of psychology, there was considerable pushback by the reviewers and somewhat of a denial that this is not as severe. Because I do a 100-year portrait of the ways in which psychology has been complicit in advancing the colonial agenda, directly or indirectly. And I name all the key founders in that paper. And I talk about how Orientalism would not have been advanced or could not have been unleashed as a political project by the West without having explicit complicity from the social scientists as well. So in that paper and several other papers and articles, so there was considerable resistance and pushback. The one that was most common was the papers would get rejected because purely on the basis that it offended some reviewer, or I was being too severe, or we are much more progressive than we have progressed, and that I'm talking more about the historical past, and that contemporary psychology has made some improvements, and why don't I speak about that? And then from other colleagues who said that there's always a risk in picking on the establishment and so on. Initially, when I was writing about it, I was doing two pieces, one for history of psychology and then another piece in human development on rethinking acculturation. So one was more anti-colonial piece, and the other one was an I was coming from an anti-racist position. One was an anti-colonial position. Both positions were very marginalized within the discipline. And to articulate a framework of psychology from an anti-colonial and an anti-racist position 20 years ago was challenging, tough, and there was a lot of emotional cost and labor involved as well because of the pushback.
I consider myself really lucky because all the work that I've done, I've always had people around who, So let me ask you this. You just said that your paper, the 2002 paper, laid out these various ways that psychology was complicit in this type of representation and this Orientalism. And it wouldn't have been possible without, the social sciences kind of bolstering these ideas. Do you remember one of the ways or two of the ways that the social sciences or psychology kind of did this, created this image in this? So any specific ways that it actually did that?
One very specific way that I argue in both Decolonizing Psychology and in that paper in 2002 is I give the example of the founder of American psychology, G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall wrote about adolescence. He coined the term. G. Stanley Hall established APA at Clark University, where I studied. But he was considered to be the founder, a pioneer, a hero of psychology. And that's how the story was told to us. But only much later, when I started reading his work, that I found him to be an advocate for colonialism, where he speaks darkly about that if we don't domesticate and if we don't control and train these so-called primitive people, this world that we're living in would be, overrun by people who are sort of inferior in their thinking, and so on. So we needed to either, I think he uses words, and I have an excerpt in that, and off the cuff I can remember, he says, we need to do this kind of thinking with politicians and soldiers about how to domesticate or wipe out these populations. So there was a hint, maybe not an explicit agenda of genocide, but that sort of went very unacknowledged in many of these theorists, including Darwin's work that I, with my colleague Stephanie Shields, we both published a piece in American Psychologist where we trace some of the racism that was espoused in his work. Yes, so those are two instances I could give, and then there are several others that I draw out about the modern subject of who the psychological subject is. The psychological subject, essentially, I say the modern subject is white, Anglo-Saxon, upper class, elite American. Around this subject, from this subject emanates much of knowledge about human psychology, and then gets transported and exported to the rest of the world. I was not, of course, the first one to say that. There were many others whom I give credit to in my book, on whom I was, drawing on to make some of these claims.
Thank you for that. I don't know if people are aware that, G. Stanley Hall was like a big figure, right? These aren't people on the margins of psychology. Or I think the work of, was it Cyril Burt? Another, intelligence as something that's inherited, and then turned out that a lot of his data was fake and just completely. So yeah, these were big people in psychology. So thank you for talking about that. I want to come back to what you said about the self. you talked about, the Indian culture, which is kind of a bizarre statement because it's so heterogeneous, and every few 100 miles, there are new languages and stuff. But the Indian culture, you said, has this huge set of knowledge on the self. But the way we usually talk about the self in psychology, and even in the West, where you and I live, at least in the U.S., I mean, I've heard people say things like, you have to find your true self, or be yourself. And I sometimes wondered, that makes sense to me, but if I, as a child, I told my mother I'm trying to be myself, she would look at me as if, like, this is the most absurd thing to say. What does that even mean?
Right.
And now I know it's not because she didn't care. It's because it's a bizarre concept. So we can say the word self, but they mean different things. And you've written about the neoliberal self. So could you say a little bit about this idea of self that is there in psychology, and especially the neoliberal self that most of psychology kind of tends to and, works with? What is the self?
We have spent over a millennia speaking, inquiring, writing, analyzing the term self. And I think it was Kenneth Burke, the literary critic, who said it's like a God term. And this God term sort of defines all of the theories and explanations from there, like democracy, justice, love. So this is one of those, self-other term that's very central to psychology. But yet it's to me, one way to kind of think about the self, especially from within the Indian context, was that the self is always thought about as embedded within the family, within the community, within the neighborhood. The distinctions between self and other are fairly, to use your own word, very slippery. Something you mentioned in your article, that this is a kind of slippery subjectivity. They cannot be encased within the individual. I think psychology's faith or understanding is based on, for a long time, has been on the idea of the individual as self-contained, as atomic, and that self which fashions itself as separate from other. The transcendence was a very important concept. So with colonization come very new ideas about self and its location to society and caste, and also power. And after colonization, in post-colonial condition, we say that coloniality continued. So even though the British left and we became independent, and many Asian and African states, nation states became independent, but they lived in a post-colonial condition where the colonial framework pretty much continued.
Right.
So there was that other framework which became, I would say, very powerful in understanding the self. And then the fourth one, around the 70s, you see, is the unleashing of what we call modern globalization. With modern forms of globalization comes the search for privatization of goods, the movement of labor, the so-called decline in social safety nets, the decline in of access to what we call public goods. And with neoliberalism comes an idea that the social structures are not going to guarantee the maintenance of self.
Right.
You have to rely on your biography, your strength, your family, your education, your credibility, your degree. So you become somewhat of an entrepreneur. Managing yourself takes a really important turn. And that language becomes very critical and crucial in maintaining the neoliberal order. So we have a sociologist named Gauri Pathak in India speaks about it, that the self has to become very presentable, she says. So the presentability of self happens by, acquiring new skills, whether it's meditation, whether it's new degrees, or how to look attractive, or how to market yourself. And that's where you have a lot of Silicon type Valley language on cross-cultural psychology comes in and gives us these sets of new sets ways of thinking about the self through peak experience, through flow, through growth mindset, And through these kind of psychological ways of thinking, which produces well-being, but it's tied to your productivity.
Absolutely.
Right. And so that's the neoliberal shift that happens that you see in the landscape, that to me is very reflective of what I would call the neoliberal economy. It's, culture and economy earlier in psychology were considered separate. And so in my book, I really chart out not only the construction of the neoliberal self that's in Decolonizing Psychology, but the different hybrid layers of the self.
And then this neoliberal self is bolstered by a lot of psychological narrative too. So, the ideas like you were talking about the management of self, and there are theories of emotional regulation and self-management and all of that. So what did you find when you did this research and when you were trying to kind of study this new type of self, this contained self that is managed and has these attributes that are inside it somehow, right? They exist inside us. What were some of your findings when you were looking at this type of self?
I mean, each community that I was studying, the elite, the transnational, the middle class, as well as the what I would call working poor. Right. Let me sort of say, a sentence about each, a sentence or two, because they have a very particular specific configuration. They're trying to go after granularity, that is making much more specific claims about these communities and showing the ways in which globalization, neoliberal globalization, was impacting and shaping their life. To start out with, what I found, the youth who were much more had access to culture capital, to elite forms of education, to wealth, were in some ways creating a very transnational identity where understanding of Indianness was framed as being highly mobile. So I use the word cultural streamlining. That is no longer they were seeing themselves through the prism of Orientalism or being backward. So what the neoliberal language gave them was a kind of Indianness that could be transported to other parts of the world. Through their education too, because it was now not only seen as cool, right, but also seen as being cosmopolitan, but yet cultural. And it was streamlined. You would see with these Silicon Valley engineers in Bangalore and in different parts of India, where a certain caliber of people who had access to this knowledge economy were able to then move through different parts of the world that was not possible for them earlier because there were barriers to their Indianness. So there was this interesting transnational that I speak about, and I give examples of someone like Nina in my book, whom I interview, who gives this is a long interview, but to give an example, she says, if there's what it means to be an Indian, what does it mean to be living in Bombay and elite? She says, well, if there's a riot, I will not be touched. I can continue going on in my life. There were others. She calls herself the ultimate Indians, because I asked her, what does that mean? Why do you call yourself? She said the ultimate in the sense that we are the ones who decipher, who understand, who set the standards of what Indianness should be, and others usually follow it through fashion, through consumption. So she was using a very consumer-oriented model. So for her, citizenship had become combined with this interesting neoliberal language of mobility, going to Oxford, studying there, practicing or keeping her what she called Jaya Parvati rituals, but yet being accepted by her German, Swiss friends, and then coming back to India and being very seamless. So that was, but behind all of this, what I say is a capitalist transnational class which supports this kind of neoliberal self. Then the middle class that I show is somewhat little different in the sense that they are educated, they've done their bachelor's in arts, but their income levels
are fairly limited, and they are now working in these large corporations as call center workers. And there's what I call them. They also consider themselves sort of the new colonial subjects. They have to go to accent reduction workshops. What I find is they're part of management practices where corporate cross-cultural psychology is used in them to maintain, regulate their practices. What I found fascinating was these participants who were call center workers had to participate in workshops where the workshop was how to understand Indianness and Americanness. So they were like, I'm okay, I understand, they were saying, and they were critiquing and joking about it. It was their resistance. They're like, I'm an Indian. Why do I need to study what Indianness means to me? Why do I need a person coming from Europe and America to tell me that Americans do it this way? And the workshop materials that I saw were really about using very traditional concepts of cross-cultural psychology, such as collectivism and individualism around that. And Indians were always seen as late, as unable to adapt, and there were characteristics given to them, argumentative, too flexible, authoritarian, hierarchy-oriented, whereas Americans were exactly the opposite, punctual, reliable, self-sufficient. If you look through many of the documents and these participation into diversity programs, management, they're all basically being invented here largely, and then they're being executed there with some reframing. It doesn't mean the participants there are somehow passively accepting it. What I found was they rejected, they resisted, but there wasn't enough room to resist it within the organizational culture. When you meet with them privately, they can make fun of it and they can call it, Gora psychology, as in white psychology. But the corporate stranglehold was so firm, the architecture of power, that because they were transnational, that many of the managers and administrators who were using MBTI personality tests and all of those had mandates from corporations.
Right.
That this is how we do, this is how we evaluate a performance. You go to an English institute, or they call it the English clinic. I mean, you would find it fascinating, and there it's forms of pathology. So if you're not able to speak fluently or in the way that Americans and British can understand it, but in that you found a very strong colonial language of how to be a self in the world. And what happens to even people who speak in a vernacular accent. So I discovered there's something called as MTI, mother tongue influence. So you have to remove your mother tongue influence, and they teach you how to remove, and they call it cleaning up your accent.
Wow, it sounds like an amputation almost.
Yeah, right. So those were, to me, still stark reminders of, and not just remnants of colonialism, but the way coloniality and kind of the after effects of colonialism continued and continuing, but have taken this interesting neoliberal turn. Then finally, the third piece that I saw was just at the level of inequality, where somehow social justice issues in psychology were not considered core to questions about well-being and constructions of self and identity. We approached somehow culture and looked at the ways in culture shapes the self, but rarely did we ask ourselves the question about, a large population of India lives in poverty and does not have access, lives with chronic hunger, does not have access to employment, education, the indicators of well-being. How is that impacting their sense of self, who they are? And why is it their lives are not, given central attention? And it's through that lens I approached the local community and sort of started asking larger questions about how the youth who were surrounded by affluence were coping, managing their lives. How was this neoliberal turn affecting them, impacting their choices? And that led to quite a bit of realization of not just inequity is fundamental, but also how they were not considered to be as proper subjects. Most of them are considered squatters living on illegal land. They're the majority of our population, but all our urban development was done as though they don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the third piece, that globalization was supposed to have uplifted them out of their poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that was another area that needed to be really spoken to, the condition of inequality. And psychology, I felt, had a really important role to play there. So that was the third community where I found these youth whose lives had actually taken a turn for the worse,
mm-hmm.
because their income levels may have gone up slightly, but everything else around them was much
right.
more expensive, as well as new call centers had come in where the aspirations had become slightly different right now.
And they don't feature, like you said, in our census, and they sure don't feature in our research and our experiments. I mean, the amount of psychological research I've seen produced in India, the subject of it still tends to be this upper caste, educated,
Correct.
cosmopolitan, city-going persons.
Correct.
So, concerning these methodological questions, then you've also written about, through research and other ways, that Euro-American psychology tends to speak for other places, and in the process silence many of these, other psychologies. Or can you say something about that? Can you think of a way like Euro-American psychology has silenced and spoken for groups of people and just taken over their narratives? Because that can absolutely happen. It can even happen it's happened in social psychology, even in community psychology, if you're not careful enough. Can kind of enter, and methodologies can turn out to be very exploitative sometimes. Can you think of a time that psychology did that?
Two ways to answer the question. One way to answer is to say that the entire enterprise of psychology for the last 150 years has essentially been speaking on behalf of the rest of humanity. While it's a very local, provincial psychology, emerging out of a very modern historical moment, in Europe and US, but embedded within that has been the universal subject, and the universal subject is a modern European subject who speaks on behalf of Asians, Africans, and so on. So that's one very clear. So in terms of emotional development, social development, what is education? What is the standard of how we live?
What is health?
What is health? What is mental health? All our psychological diagnosis that we have derived from, whether we call it schizophrenia or PTSD or trauma, they are very deeply embedded in specific cultural practices and cultural meaning frameworks, which are highly local, but then they play a very dominant role in being exported to the rest of the world. So you could see in almost social psychology, cognitive psychology, I would say currently neuroscience too, you have this kind of speaking off going on for a very long time. The other more speaking off that goes on is, I would say, is for the longest time, I think, one book that comes to my mind is one of my favorite is Decolonizing Methods by, Linda Tuhai Smith, where she speaks about the fact that research was a very dirty word in the native communities, in the Maori community in New Zealand, because almost all the research that was done on Maori communities, their way of life, was done by Europeans who basically wanted to destroy them, to use them, exploit them, keep them contained. And so for her, she always so that's one kind of example of how that particular community, for the longest time, that sense of self, their ways of life, was largely represented by American psychological frameworks within the context of Australia, New Zealand, and America. There are different ways in which Native people have been framed. Understood. So that's one example I could give you. And there's lots written by theorists who are working in the area of settler colonialism and Native American studies who are rewriting that history right now.
All right. So let me take us to my last question for this interview. Psychology, born in the global north, deeply entrenched in the values of, the global north, values such as individualism and meritocracy and all of those things. Do you think psychology can ever be truly decolonized? And what would that look like? If it was possible, what would that look like? But first, do you think it can ever be truly decolonized?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the questions since my book came out, I've been asked very, very often at different conferences, presentations, keynotes I made. And there, I would say that I think, yes, it would be decolonized, but there are some conditions under how it would be decolonized. And I think we have to think of it as a political project, and very much in the way that we thought about abolition of slavery. So you can take an abolitionist model and say the only way slavery was abolished was either it was there or not there. And in order for it to be completely abolished, you needed to change its entire structures. It's not just driven by the state, but the very idea of what it means to be a human being. So it's political, it's economic, it's cultural, it's personal, it's psychological, it's familial, it's sexual. All of these areas had to be the very idea of how we conduct business and we live, what it means to be a human being. We had to attack that idea itself from its roots, if at all. We had to create a time where slaves had to be free. It doesn't mean that there was real freedom right after proclamation. There was Jim Crow, and then there was racial segregation. There's effects that you could see that in this pandemic, where more and more African Americans are dying at higher rates because of in COVID. So there are health disparities that you can see. That doesn't mean that we don't have. But what I'm saying is that you needed essentially an abolition. I think this is Native American theorists have been speaking about this, that in decolonization model, in their view, is not really about advancing a field or taking a social justice perspective. It's really about reclaiming land and reclaiming territory, reclaiming water, reclaiming earth, language. It's a model in which you have to acknowledge that settler colonialism is continuing to happen. And decolonization really means having all of that back that was lost, essentially. So to us, there are some models of us to think about what a decolonized psychology would look like. So I think it's possible, but it's a long-term political project. And you have to take the long view and take, in some ways, not necessarily a compromise view, that even if we add a fragment here, one is the add and stir model, which we've been living under right now. That I think it was just today that in American Psychology that I saw this article, in 2008, Jeffrey Arnett's article came out.
Right. So it's the Arnett article basically said that most of research conducted in psychology, about 95%, is done on Euro-American populations. 95% was a huge number, and a lot of it is just done on American undergrads. So basically, psychology is the study of. I recently read Ian Parker's book of what psychologists think about what undergrads think, something like that. Yeah, that's the context.
Right. So, correct. Yes, and American undergraduate psychology, like they're something like 4,000 times more likely to be represented in experiments and in our studies than say some random person in Global South. So to me, the project of decolonization is very viable. In order to reach the goal, I would call complete decolonization in the way Francis Fanon speaks about, it has to be a new humanity, what he speaks about. You have to definitely identify and really dismantle. There is an undoing has to happen of the colonial structure right now. Identification alone is not enough or suffices. You can't have compromises as such and say, because the colonial structure are like tentacles. There are all levels of knowledge production, editors, writers, the power of the US Academy. Mm-hmm. And these tentacles basically, very much like the neoliberal order, control, regulate all the knowledge production of psychology across the world. Which knowledge is considered elite, who gets published where, who gets tenure, who doesn't get tenure, who is considered, which journal is considered prestigious, and so on. So that mapping, that archaeology, that architecture of identifying these tentacles on which the coloniality of psychology is built has to be first formed and made and identified and analyzed. Mm-hmm. We're not even there yet. We've just basically just opened up the conversation of what decolonizing really means. Yeah. And then when that project, I would say, goals are fulfilled, or we are there, we have to a certain extent understood in way coloniality is being reproduced through colonization and through power, then we have to ask ourselves larger question of what does it mean to do psychology, because what does it mean to be a human being? Mm-hmm. Where we would have to look at not necessarily just the Eurocentric conceptions of psychology, which are those so deep-seated. There has to be a revival of indigenous concepts that were lost for 500 years, that were not given any credibility, legitimacy. I'm not saying they're pure or somehow they exist without being impacted by colonialism, modernism, traditional. It's not that they're just sitting there, but there are viable frameworks. And I'll give you an example of contemplative practices such as Buddhist practices, Buddhist psychology or Vipassana, which have been handed down for 1,000 years from Buddha to his disciples, to then it went to Burma and Sri Lanka. And these Vipassana, basically insight practices, it means, way of seeing Vipassana means, they were in some ways Silicon Valley in the United States understood the power of these, diluted it, made it into mindfulness to a certain extent, minus the foundations, co-opted all kinds of it. And interesting, has sold it back to India, as mindfulness for that class where there's a lot of there with the mindfulness movement that is powerful, amazing, transformative. I would not necessarily want to critique it without, this caveat. But at the same time, there is a commercial interest by which this flow has happened. So to me, there are potential practices in many of these indigenous philosophical, religious community psychologies that exist that we haven't even yet found out what they relationally mean, for someone who's in Brazil and someone who's in India, without necessarily invoking the language of Eurocentric knowledge. So what we're doing right now is a lot of translation, essentially, translating it back to, so the knowledge of indigenous frameworks is translated back to an American audience. And in that translation, we are not speaking in the original language in which some of the essence is. So to me, one is the Indian, and second, I think colonization is very much deeply rooted in capitalism. Which at this moment of our crisis that we're living in has very brutally and very starkly exposed the haves and the have-nots, the people who have care, who don't have care, who can stay at home, who can't, or the frontline workers who are in the face, so to speak, fighting this virus. So to me, for a long time, psychology is also, because it's so much rooted in the individual, part of the project of colonization, coloniality, has been to keep the individual intact and the idea of the individual intact. So there is, so that project of decolonization would mean that we have to really not just rethink our structure. So the intellectual project of decolonization will also only be fulfilled when many of us come together in solidarity.
All right. We are also kind of running out of time. Thank you so much. This was fantastic, and it was great having you here. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Yeah, I loved it. I feel like I'm speaking to a fellow traveler. It's like shared subjectivity.
Like you said, shared subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.